Hi, I'm Al Cho. I'm Chief Strategy and External Affairs Officer at Xylem. Xylem is a global water technology company whose purpose it is to empower our customers and communities to create a more water secure world. I've been to the summit a number of times, and there's no other venue like it in terms of being able to understand the current state of the water sector and its future directions as well. It brings together a really interesting array of stakeholders from different parts of the water sector, and it's an opportunity to align perspectives, but also potentially even create new partnerships around the issues that emerge from the discussion. This year, Xylem is really excited to be the sponsor of a set of initiatives around the global CAPEX outlook. And so we'll be looking at questions around how are utilities adapting to rising expectations, and how is that getting reflected in CAPEX budgets, particularly as those CAPEX budgets evolve to reflect the needs associated with resilience. I think it's really an important emerging theme. Utilities have already been facing deficits in terms of the ability to invest, and that deficit is going to grow because of the rising needs associated with resilience. McKinsey recently released a report that looked at the United States alone that has a $100 billion annual CAPEX deficit, which will grow to almost $200 billion a year due to the rising needs around resilience. The demands on utilities are growing because the stakeholders around them are looking to them to support resilience through water and water management. But that's placing increasing demands for more infrastructure, and that's going to be reflected ultimately in the capital expenditures in our sector. There's some research out there right now that looks at the changes in CAPEX budgets. And in the US, for example, it's projected that resilience-related capital investments as a share of total capital spending will rise from about 21% in 2024 to close to 40% in 2027. And in the UK, for example, that's going from around 18% to 27%. So we're seeing a very significant ramp in the amount of investment that's taking place in the sector, particularly those investments that are related to this broader theme of risk reduction, water security, and resilience. So the CAPEX surge is related to resilience because some of the expectations on what we invest in are changing, right? So for many, many years, water, which is the most capital intensive utility, right, was about building the infrastructure that's needed to deliver clean water and manage wastewater. But communities are also now tasking utilities to think about broader resilience related themes like how do we secure our communities from drought? How do we deal with stormwater when rainfall peaks? How do we deal with sea level rise and the flooding associated with that? Around the world, we're seeing utilities whose primary business used to be delivering clean water and managing wastewater have their mandates expand based on what governments and local stakeholders are asking them to do. You know, Singapore, for example, is now managing sea level rise, right? New York City is managing flooding. And pretty much everywhere, utilities are being asked to deal with variability in rainfall and water supply to ensure security of water supply for rapidly growing needs. And so those new mandates all require investment, and that requires capital investment in resilience. Well, it comes back to our purpose. Our purpose is to empower our customers and our communities to create a more water secure world. And when you think about water security and this theme of building infrastructure that's capable of delivering resilience to communities, we're very interested in making sure that we're able to fulfill that mission with our customers and the communities that they serve. We also think that some of the big barriers to delivering resilience are technological in nature, right? And so part of what we can do as a private sector partner to the utilities and other stakeholders in the water sector is developing solutions that help them achieve the resilience they're looking for at lower cost and higher certainty. I think there are three big challenges to delivering the CAPEX surge for resilience. I mean, the first one is technological, right? There are solutions that are out there that need to be delivered, but doing it in a patchwork fashion is going to be challenging, as opposed to doing it systematically, strategically, and in a way that kind of reinforces itself. And so, for example, we've been looking a lot at digital solutions that can support resilience, but it's really important that those digital solutions interconnect and create a unified platform for managing the many different kinds of assets that have to become more resilient as a system. And so we've made big investments, for example, in resolving some of the data silos and challenges with creating situational awareness of an entire utility's infrastructure so that you can make better decisions about how to reduce risk across the entire system. So there are instruments that can be created from a technological perspective that will ease the pathway toward more resilient infrastructure. And digital is just a part of that. I think the second major issue is a financial issue, right? In the McKinsey survey that we supported around resilience investments in the United States, for example, there was a really big gap in utilities saying that their stakeholders supported investments in resilience, which a lot of utilities said, our stakeholders want us to do this. And the number of utilities who said, we're able to raise the funds to do this, right? And so it's a perfect encapsulation of the fact that there's this rising mandate to invest in resilience, but the financing and funding mechanisms to enable utilities to do this are still developing. And it's just not fair to ask utilities to take on more without supporting them to do that, right? And so one of the, I think, key messages of this CAPEX shift has to be that utilities are already stretched. It doesn't do any good to say, hey, utilities, go do more. It has to be a collaborative effort with stakeholders across the sector, including the governance stakeholders around utilities, saying, okay, we've got a resilience challenge. How are we collectively going to support institutions to fund it? Right? And I think that's the third challenge, was the institutional question, right? Who's responsible for resilience, right? Is there a resilience utility? Are we going to create new utilities to support some of the new resilience-related challenges? My gut is that we've already got a lot of institutional fragmentation in the sector. And so it's important to think about how we maybe evolve the mandates and evolve the institutional support for managing resilience. But those are questions that have to be decided locality by locality with the stakeholders who are involved. And so I think we've got those technological issues, we've got those financial issues, and we've got those institutional issues. And that's part of what we've got to do as a sector in confronting this gap in terms of how we are going to mobilize the funding for and ultimately implement a sensible set of investments that will enable us all to become more resilient. So, in thinking about the institutional evolution of the sector, I think we have to stop thinking about, for example, solution providers as just vendors who are there to sell us stuff, right? We've got to think of each stage of the value chain as collaborations or collaborative partners in delivery of resilience-related solutions. Because at the end of the day, different stakeholders have different things they can contribute to the mix. Every stakeholder is better positioned to bear a certain degree of the risk in implementing resilience-related projects. And I think we've got to get creative about how we involve all of those partners in ways that might look different than how we've done that in the past. I think a major theme is, what do institutions do themselves and what do they enlist partners in supporting, right? And so one of the things that we're seeing, for example, in the management of digital solutions is that for a really long time, organizations would try to build things themselves and maintain it with their own teams. But that was a recipe for continual investment and sometimes technical debt. By looking at areas where vendors or partners or solution providers can effectively not just provide, solutions or services, but ultimately even become delivery partners or outsourced providers of capabilities that, really cut across the whole sector. I think that might be an evolution in delivery models that the sector is going to move toward. So I think when it comes to building resilience to drought, Digital solutions have a huge role to play. Obviously, when we think about building a more water resilient and water secure world, I think starting with efficiency first is an important principle. And so eliminating leakage, optimizing our systems, reducing energy dependency, all of these things are an important part of creating a more resilient posture. Over time, I think we've also got to make investments in alternative water supplies. So we're big fans of scaling water reuse technologies, both in terms of municipal water reuse and industrial water recycling and reuse. And so these are all levers that I think will become increasingly important. When it comes to flood management, I think early warning systems, situational awareness that becomes more and more spatially high resolution, those are all types of things that will help communities become better prepared. The ability to run simulations about how floods will affect different parts of a catchment and pre-position assets to address flooding. Those are all the kinds of investments that can be made today in order to improve flood resilience as well. So there are technological solutions that are available today. There's more innovation that still needs to take place to make those even more integrated and less expensive. But I think we've got a pathway to begin making the investments that are needed to reduce the residual risk associated with natural disasters. I think the technologies for resilience are available today and ready for deployment. I think over time, as we begin to scale them, they will potentially become even easier to access. So I think Christopher wrote a really good article a couple of weeks ago about water reuse technology. We know that water reuse should be even more economical and much easier to implement, for example, than desalination, just by virtue of what's in the water that comes in as influent. But the cost dispersion of water use projects is huge. And so that's one of those areas where I think the sector can work together to begin to streamline, regularize, and ultimately lower the cost of delivery for these water recycling and reuse projects, because I think they are the future for sustainable management and the improvement of resilience in many communities around the world. I think while we understand that these issues are global issues, the more examples that we can hear around specific challenges that communities are facing and how they are in practice overcoming these challenges, I think will be a really useful set of lessons for other communities to learn from. Because at the end of the day, I think the shifts in CAPEX that the GWI CAPEX survey is demonstrating is just the tip of the iceberg, right? There's a lot of investments that will be made that are still early in the planning stages and aren't showing up in the numbers, which are already showing a pretty significant shift in kind of where budgets are going. And so as more and more communities have to implement these larger projects, these early lessons are going to be very important to shifting the trajectory of the sector and making it easier and easier for the next utility or the next community to implement these solutions.